Hi guys, welcome to this short lecture on due diligence in real estate development. Real estate is a capital intensive investment, and usually investors would want to be sure of the risk associated with each purchase. And this is important for many reasons. One of them is that your due diligence can help to avoid abortive expenditures and costs associated with real estate transactions. So let's jump in and look at the content of today's lecture. And so from a presentation outline point of view, I'm going to look at 6 items. So I'll look at an introduction to due diligence, and then we will define due diligence. We'll then jump on to look at the functions and objectives of due diligence, and then we'll look at the process of due diligence, some types of due diligence, and then we'll look at a practical case of due diligence for development land acquisition in Ghana. So let's start with introduction. Now, the concept of due diligence originates from US American capital and investor protection law. Due diligence can be defined as a detailed examination, analysis, and assessment of the circumstances of the transaction object in fact and in law, right? And so 2 key words are important here. One is that you're looking at the circumstance of the real estate asset. That could be a house, it could be a land. That is a subject matter of the investigation, both in fact and then in law. Okay, so in essence, we'll be looking at the physical and then the legal dimensions of the property, the house or the land that is the subject matter of investigation. Now, in some aspects, due diligence is essentially the legal yardstick for negligence. Due diligence is the legal yardstick for negligence, which may arise due to contractual or statutory obligations, right? And it can be applied to both the acquisition of direct real estate or indirect real estate. And so due diligence can be applied to direct real estate in the sense of the development of new real estate. And it can be applied to indirect real estate in the form of the acquisition of a stock of a real estate company. Now, the origins of due diligence processes is the information gap between the potential parties to a transaction contract. And so the sellers of real estate or of land usually tend to have more information about the real estate than the buyers of that real estate. And so the due diligence process is meant to reduce the information asymmetry that may exist between the seller and the buyer. And in many cases, this is influenced by the interest of the seller and the buyer. Now, this differentiation in interest also leads to different types of due diligence. And so a seller, for instance, may be interested in knowing more about the purchaser of his or her property, and hence may undertake some form of due diligence. But what is even more important to a seller is knowing the true state of the property he or she wants to sell, right? That helps to strengthen the position of the seller so that he or she will not be caught off guard by surprises resulting from the buyer's due diligence. And so a seller may also conduct a due diligence to inform his position, especially on price relative to the condition of the property that he or she wants to sell. But in many cases, and perhaps in most cases, it is the buyer who conducts the due diligence, right? And that is because very often the sellers will tend to give out very limited information about themselves and the subject property he or she wants to sell. And so the due diligence process enables the buyer to delve deep and dig into various relevant documents that can help him or her make the best of decisions, right? And so when we think of the buyer's due diligence, we are often thinking about what is called the buy-side due diligence. And this buy-side due diligence may usually come in two forms. So the first is what is referred to as a preliminary due diligence, or what some scholars may refer to as a red flag due diligence, or high-level diligence, or initial due diligence. And the second stage of the due diligence process in the transaction process is the confirmatory due diligence. So after you have conducted a preliminary due diligence, you may also conduct a confirmatory due diligence before you close the deal. And then the seller's due diligence is often referred to as a reverse due diligence, or a pre-sale due diligence, or a vendor side due diligence. So let me summarize the content of this slide. So there are two key types of due diligence. And these due diligence are influenced by the interests of the sellers and the buyers of real estate. So typically, due diligence is conducted by the buyers of real estate. And for the buyer, the type of real estate due diligence he conducts is what is called the buy-side due diligence. And this can be differentiated in two stages: the preliminary due diligence and the confirmatory due diligence. Now, the sellers also conduct due diligence, which is also referred to as the reverse due diligence, the pre-sale due diligence, or the vendor side due diligence, to acquaint him or herself with the necessary information to strengthen his negotiation position, right? And so by knowing about the true state of the property, the seller is able to negotiate well. Now, why do we conduct due diligence? More formally, as I indicated earlier, and especially in real estate transactions, due diligence is influenced by the interest of the contracting parties. For the buyer, he wants to get the lowest possible price. For us, the seller wants to get the highest possible counter value at a high level of transaction security and legal certainty. Right. And in terms of function, the due diligence report or exercise usually seeks to determine, analyze, assess, and control the various risks and opportunities connected with a transaction or a piece of property, right? And so, and this, especially in the real estate space, this due diligence can be done for both the corporate level and the real estate level. So by corporate level, I mean you can assess a real estate company, or it can be done at the real estate level or the asset level, right? So you can look at a whole company, a due diligence for a whole company, and then you can also do a due diligence for just the assets owned by the real estate company. Now, there are at least 7 key processes involved in the real estate due diligence process, according to Steppenhorst. Now, the first step in the real estate due diligence would be the seller due diligence. Remember, I made the point earlier that sellers also do due diligence. And the reason why they do the due diligence is to inform them about the true state of the property they wish to sell, right? And so after the due diligence has been conducted, it helps to generate enough information that can be used in the preparation of the investment memorandum, which will subsequently be shared with potential buyers. Then in stage 2, there is an analysis of the property. So here there is an analysis of the land. And this analysis would involve an analysis of interesting properties as to cash flows, and then the risk associated with those cash flows. It could also include, for example, a selection of properties that match the portfolio strategy, right? And it is usually at this stage that some form of preliminary due diligence is conducted. So here, potential parties to a contract, a land contract or a real estate contract, we use the opportunity to identify red flags, red flags at this point. And usually the seller would use this opportunity to conduct some search of the potential or prospective buyers and the bids they put in for the property he or she wants to sell. Now, in the third stage, this is where various conditions that would underline the sale is usually determined, right? And so we talk about the commercial negotiations. And here, exclusivity clauses, confidentiality clauses, or even access to data, right, would all be negotiated at this point. Then again, it is in this third stage that potential buyers who have been given some form of access to the seller's data on the property, usually for preliminary assessments of the viability and the feasibility of their project, may now be encouraged to put in a letter of intent to buy the property within a certain period of time. Now, in the fourth stage, a detailed buyer due diligence is conducted. And here, the buyer would be given access, usually from a short list of prospective buyers who have expressed interest by way of a letter of intent in the facility, right? And they would have the opportunity to conduct a full due diligence, both of the physical, the legal, the technical, and even of the tax implications of the purchase, right? And the information generated from this fourth stage will feed into the preparation of a sale and purchase agreement. And it would also inform how negotiations in terms of the sale and purchase agreement would go, right? And so you see that in stage 5, negotiations will be influenced by the information from the buyer's due diligence stage. The information also inform the preparation of the final contractual documentation. It will also inform the preparation of board approvals and approval of acquisition and so on. In stage 6, this is where the two parties, the buyer and the seller, closes the deal based on the sale and purchase agreement that has been reached in stage 5, right? And then the last stage is the asset management stage, where the asset is transferred from transaction management now to asset management, right? And it is during this stage too, you'll find that some lease contracts may be signed between the new owner and then the tenants that may come in here. And some form of due diligence may result in the process as well. In terms of approaches to due diligence, there are two main approaches. You have the inductive approach and then the deductive approach. Perhaps let me start from the deductive approach. Now, in the purchase of real estate, investors usually do that for some kind of value, right? That value may be in terms of profitability. And so, in a deductive approach to due diligence, investors focus their attention on finding or identifying variables that affect that value of interest to them, right? So it may be the level of cash flows, the net asset values, and so on, right? And so the deductive approach to due diligence seems to be more focused, right, on specific variables as compared to an inductive approach. So in a deductive due diligence approach, usually buyers armed with knowledge of the drivers or the factors of real estate value will set certain assumptions based on which the due diligence will be guided, right? However, in an inductive approach, usually the process focuses on all aspects of the property or all topics of the property, right, in a very systematic way. So it's the case that it is usually a bottom-up approach which deals with every information. The risk of an inductive approach is that it may turn, it's likely to focus on irrelevant materials, or it may end up generating irrelevant information or information that is not relevant to the transaction at hand, right? And then there's a third type of due diligence that combines both the inductive approach and the deductive approach. So in this case, the person conducting the due diligence may focus on, say, one approach in the first phase of the due diligence, and then may focus on another approach in the second phase of the due diligence. Remember, I mentioned that the due diligence process can be broken down into the first phase, which is the preliminary due diligence stage, and then the second phase, which is the confirmatory due diligence phase. So what some people tend to do is that in the first phase, which is the preliminary due diligence stage, they will tend to conduct an inductive approach, or they will tend to follow an inductive approach, which will collect as many or as much information as possible. And in the second phase, they will narrow down on the drivers of value for the shareholders or for the stakeholders. And that is what is going to drive the process. So in summary, there are two key processes, two key approaches to due diligence. You have the inductive approach, which is a very comprehensive approach, usually a bottom-up approach, which collects as much information as possible, whereas the deductive due diligence approach focuses on the values or the variables of interest, right? And so it tends to be limited or focused on specific things. And hence, in some respect, some blind spots or some issues may be left out, which later on might turn out to be relevant in the process. Now, we can combine the two in what is called a combined approach, where in the two phases of the due diligence process, each approach will be applied. In terms of the types of due diligence in real estate transactions, there are at least 4 types. So you have the tax due diligence, you have the financial due diligence, you have the technical due diligence, and then you have the legal due diligence. Now, I have arranged these 4 due diligence types in concentric circles in this form to highlight a very important point. So it is believed that law guides human behavior, or law guides every transaction in any economy. In other words, law is the basis of human behavior and business transactions. And so the legal due diligence is usually the basis of all the other types of due diligence. Okay, and I will talk about each of these 4 different types of due diligence in the next video. Stay tuned.